So we have some more Supreme Court news.
Yeah,
what do we have here?
actually two really significant cases here, one good and one bad. Let's start with the bad, in my view, this decision on unions. This was a split vote between conservative bloc of 6 and the 3 remaining liberals on the court over whether or not union organizers can visit farm workers while they're working in the fields. So this dates back to a 1975 California Agricultural Labor Relations Act. Union organizers have always had a really hard time accessing farm workers. Oftentimes they're migratory, they're following one harvest to the next. Oftentimes they live in temporary housing. They may lack English language skills. And so there's this law in place in California since 1975 that says you can visit them in this really limited basis while they're at the workplace. It's like for 1 hour every so many days. So again, very, very narrow and limited. This was challenged by a number of major growers in California, and ultimately the conservative justices on the court, again, acting together as a bloc, and Roberts wrote the majority opinion here, decided that this amounted to, this is Roberts' language, that this access regulation amounts to simple appropriation of private property, adding that the access regulation grants labor organizations a right to invade the grower's property. It therefore constitutes a per se physical taking. So basically putting the rights of private property owners, businesses, corporations over the right of union organizers to try to talk to and organize these farm workers. The liberal dissent, which was written by Breyer, said access was temporary, not permanent. Therefore, it does not constitute a government taking under the law. Also said that agricultural employers are not forever denied any power to control the use of their property, and said that this is not functionally equivalent to the classic taking in which government directly appropriates private property or oust the owner from his domain. So one of the things that you've been tracking and I've been tracking from the beginning is if you want to know what ACB and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were really put on the court to do, this is it. Bolster corporations, any sort of labor rights, you're going to tamp those down, side with big corporate interests, and this is a very clear-cut example of that. And look, we already know how hard it is to organize a union in this country. The deck is wildly stacked against you, as we saw in Bessemer, Alabama. This is just one more addition to that like preponderance of difficulty for forming a union and being able to give workers a little bit of power.
I mean, this pairs again actually well with the Adams thing, which is that why do Republicans and many conservatives are obsessed with the Supreme Court? It's because of abortion and because of guns. And maybe you'll get those, although I'm actually still doubtful, but this is the other part of what you're gonna get. And this is part of, goes back in the conservative movement called the three-legged stool, which is like the economic libertarians, the social conservatives and the neoconservatives, a lot going on there. And basically the social cons put their fate into the economic libertarians and have now found out about 30 years later that, oh, they basically got played. They used their votes consistently in order to prop up basically a libertarian interpretation of a lot of business law. And having known some people in the conservative legal movement or people who write about it and more, this is what they're really obsessed with.
Yes.
Like, this is what gets them out of bed. Administrative law, making sure regulation can't go through, and more. It's a very big departure from a lot of a traditional conservative thought, but the Federalist Society, in my opinion, is probably one of the most successful right-wing, quote-unquote, political projects of the 21st century. If you really, I mean, in almost every other aspect of American life, conservatives have failed miserably on almost every issue. And yet, on the Supreme Court and in legal jurisprudence, they run the show. And it's because they have this huge pipeline from law school all the way up to the judges, you know, in terms of people like Roberts and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and ACB. They're all part of the FedSoc kind of mafia, which is that those people have a very specific interpretation of business law and more. I have friends in many of the biggest law schools, the best law schools in the country, part of these chapters, and they tell me this is what they talk about all the time in terms of what really like gets people going. And so I want people to understand that what you want and think doesn't really matter. This is one of those places where it's purely kind of an elite funded project that has now been going on for so long and is so successful that it's got 6 votes on the US Supreme Court.
Yeah, conservatives, I would phrase it differently.
Yeah.
Conservatives have succeeded everywhere that their desires back up the capital class.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
corporate interests, busting labor unions, right? Military-industrial complex, going to war, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Wildly successful at. I mean, that's really it. Follow the money. If there was money to be made on an issue, it has been wildly successful. And so the court, bolstering those good old-fashioned American apple pie values here by continuing to make it very hard to organize some of the most disenfranchised people, frankly, in the country, which is migratory farm workers who have faced historically incredibly abusive conditions, putting the rights of private property first. There was another case, though, that I was a little bit heartened. This is a good one. This wasn't a huge surprise, but it was still good to see. There's also a weird dissent on this. So in an 8-1 ruling, the Supreme Court says that a Pennsylvania school cannot punish a cheerleader for swearing on Snapchat. And we covered this over at Rising.
Yeah.
So this girl in high school, she didn't make the varsity cheerleading squad. They put her on JV instead. She was pissed off. She sent a snap that said, fuck school, fuck softball, fuck cheer, fuck everything. Relatable. Very relatable, right?
Yeah, right.
And not even
teenage girl on Snapchat.
Yeah, I mean, very,
Whatever.
nothing crazy here. And apparently there was one other follow-up one where she was complaining, but this was the one that really, I guess, got her. So she gets kicked off the cheerleading squad, punished because of what she says here. And she took this to court. And 8-1, they ruled, no, you still have free speech rights. Even if you're, in school doesn't take precedence over your First Amendment free speech rights. So fairly straightforward ruling here, and nice to see the conservatives and the liberals coming together. What was interesting is that the one dissent was Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, right.
Who is sort of a hardliner in some other ways on free speech. Like, he doesn't think that social media platforms should be able to ban people at all. Mm-hmm. So on that issue, he's fairly radical. But here he argued that schools may have more authority, not less, to discipline students who transmit speech through social media, because off-campus speech made through social media can be received on campus and can spread rapidly to countless people. It often will have a greater proximate tendency to harm the school environment than will an off-campus, in-person conversation. So I thought that was a curious, kind of surprising dissent in this case, but glad to see ultimately that, I think it was a pretty straightforward application of the First Amendment that bolstered this cheerleader's case.
Thomas is always a weird one to pile down.
He's hard,
he's libertarian in a way, also conservative. He's actually a swing vote sometimes in certain cases. It's very strange. People don't really understand. There's Alito, who's very into guns and the law and order. Then Clarence Thomas, who is kind of a doctrinaire, conservative-ish. Kavanaugh is more of your traditional FedSoc, more corporate type. Then ACB, much more of a culture warrior, still also the economic libertarian. And then Roberts is just a guy who really doesn't want more justices on the Supreme Court.
He just wants to
At this point,
keep the Supreme Court the way
everybody please calm down. Everyone calm down. Also, I'm going to continue my legacy of being a Bush toady. So that's Saagar and Jetty's.
Thank you for that breakdown.
Yeah, that is Saagar and Jetty's role. And Gorsuch is just a hardcore weirdo libertarian, in my opinion, worst justice on the entire court.
Really? Interesting.
Worst one, hands down. And as people know, I can't stand libertarians, so there we go. But it's look, in the 8-1, it's a heartening thing, which is, come on. Of course you have free speech whenever you're talking online in an off-campus environment, and the school cannot punish you. They literally suspended her from the cheer team. I can't even believe it. And I remember there were inklings of this, right, when I was in I think it was a senior year of high school. And they were like, well, what you say on Facebook, we can monitor that, and we could suspend. Well, also, I wasn't in America, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But if I was, I remember thinking, this is BS. We can say whatever we want over there. So rebellious, 18-year-old Saagar. But I can see this type of stuff. It must have gotten 10 times worse, in the last 10, 15 years or so in high school and more. And so I do think it's very important, actually, that we establish these type of ground rules, especially when kids have phones at 9 years old now, and, Instagram and TikTok accounts or whatever when they're 11.
Yeah.
So having this rock solid kind of belief there pairs very well with past ACLU law, where students have free speech, right to protest, and more whenever they're in school. I think it's very important as we move forward.
Also, who was the snitch that told the school about this
how
totally anodyne snap?
Yeah.
Really? You're going to go to the principal with that? Give me a break.
Screw you.